Welcome back to a Slice of News, where I cut you off a slice of news. A recent change by the United States Postal Service on how postmarks work may cause some issues in the upcoming elections for mail-in ballots. For a long time, postmarks were considered the sign of when something was mailed. You saw the postmark and it said a date, and you said, oh, that's the date in which this piece of mail was mailed, so that you could firmly establish when that piece of mail was sent. As of now, the postmark will denote when the piece of mail at the processing facility, not when Postal Service took possession of that piece of mail. This change, as well as a cost-cutting measure recently implemented that eliminated evening mail pickup from post offices more than 50 miles away from a regional processing facility. People living out in rural areas may see their mail postmarked and delivered an entire day later than they would have in the past. That wouldn't be a huge deal for regular correspondence, but when it comes to things like mail-in votes and other time-sensitive mail, this new change could really turn out to be a serious issue. Rural voters who are sending in their mail-in ballot a couple days before the deadline may end up not having their vote counted at all because it ends up arriving too late to be counted. And they can no longer count on the postmark to denote that they mailed it in time. And that would even include states that allowed a 4-day grace period to count mail-in ballots if they arrived after Election Day. And even before this change, it was an issue. Nearly 104,000 mail-in votes were rejected in this past election because they were marked as having arrived too late to be counted. Last-minute mail-in voting is now a gamble because now you run the risk of your vote being mailed in time but not being marked or delivered in time, so that your vote is never counted. And of course, it's not only mail-in votes that would be affected by this new change. For a long time, postmarks were used to establish deadlines for stuff like tax payments and other legal filing. So if you can no longer count on the postmark actually denoting when a piece of mail was mailed, a lot of time-sensitive stuff is now at risk, marked as being sent on time or have them delivered on time, which are going to throw a lot of things into chaos potentially. So while it has more far-reaching consequences than just mail-in votes, it's hard to see this decision not as a very clear attack on mail-in votes by the current administration. I mean, let's remember that back in 2020, Donald Trump said that mail-in votes were the only reason he lost that election to Joe Biden, and actually proposed a full-on ban on mail-in voting entirely. One of the interesting things about mail-in votes is that while it is true that a lot of Democrat voters like using mail-in voting to cast their ballot during election time, a lot of the mail-in voters being most hurt by these rule changes are actually going to be Republicans who live in areas where casting their vote in person is unfeasible, and mailing in their vote is the only way for them to cast their vote at all and have their voice heard. Mail-in voting in general is vital to the democratic process. Many people, both Republican and Democrat, simply are unable to get time off of their work on Election Day to go in person to a polling place and cast their vote. Voting absentee is literally their only way to have their vote counted. Not to mention military personnel overseas who mail-in voting is literally their only way to cast their vote because they're not even in the physical United States at that time. Of course, the USPS says this is all just about cost cutting and making things more efficient. But it's hard not to see this as a very targeted attack against and just making voting harder in general unless you're going in person to a polling place, which, as I established, is not even an option for many people. And since data shows that overwhelmingly Republicans are the ones who tend to vote in person the most, it seems clear which side they're trying to give an advantage to. I've been saying for a while now that for Republicans, the only way they can win an election is to cheat. And this change with the postmarks really just seems like yet another example of something that confirms that. If they truly cared about free and fair elections, as they claim, they would be making mail-in voting easier, not harder. They would not be building in systems that ensure the possibility of you casting your vote and it just never getting counted. Because, hey, this postmark says that it came in after the cutoff date and therefore your vote no longer counts. Even though you mailed it in time, postmark doesn't reflect that anymore. This hindrance of mail-in voting is extra concerning to some people because they feel that in-person voting has become a bit more questionable. With the sale of Dominion Voting Systems, the company that provided the voting machines for in-person voting being sold to a company headed by a former Republican election official. Some question, even if they cast their ballot in person, if their vote is going to be counted accurately. So for them, mailing in their vote feels like the only way to be sure that the vote that they cast is the vote that gets counted. If one were to be more conspiracy-minded, one might come to the conclusion that this push for in-person voting and less mail-in voting is intentional because they know that the in-person voting machines are compromised in favor of Republicans, so hurting mail-in voting is helping the GOP. I'm not entirely sure I buy into that completely, but I do feel like there's something nefarious going on here, that it's not just purely a cost-cutting measure. There doesn't feel like a good reason to change the way the postmarks works and just have it say when it got to the sorting facility, especially when you, the postal consumer, have no control over when your mail got to the sorting facility. All you have direct control over is when you physically mailed this piece of correspondence. So you could point to that postmark as evidence of when you put that thing in the mail. But if it's only getting marked when it gets to the sorting facility, that could be a day, 2 days after you put it in the mailbox or gave it to the postal worker at the office. And that day or two of delay, which you have no control over, may be the difference between something being marked and arriving on time and not. For the average person, a couple days of delay in their mail being delivered isn't a huge deal, but for some, it is a very huge deal. This rule change at least opens a window to a potential for a withholding of mail-in votes, which results in invalidation of them because they can say, look, the postmark is from after the cutoff date, therefore all of these votes are now invalidated. Not saying for sure that they would, but the fact that that was even a possibility is in itself a concern. For a lot of reasons, in-person voting is the ideal scenario, but for many that's just not an option, and it should not be that they are disenfranchised purely because they are unable to vote in person. If we as a nation truly believe that every vote counts, we have to make it so that every vote can count and not leave people wondering if their vote is actually going to count if they didn't mail their vote in a week before the cutoff date. This rule change, while not possibly overtly aimed at it, feels like a method of undermining the voting system and the democratic process as a whole. For a lot of people, they have it ingrained in their mind that the date posted is the date marked. That's why it's a postmark. They are confident that if they put their mail in the postbox before the last labeled collection time, they can be confident that it will be marked as having been mailed on that date. And they can say, yes, here's the proof I mailed it on this date. And now they can no longer say that. It's now less a postmark and more a processing mark. People should be able to trust the Postal Service to not only get and send out their mail in a timely manner, but to have it marked as having been. If people can no longer count on that, they're not going to trust the U.S. Postal Service as a whole. And it is possible that in part that's the idea. Those on the right have been trying to find a way to privatize Postal Service for years, and growing a dissatisfaction and distrust for the USPS would be the perfect way to get people to embrace and adopt the new private Postal Service, one that's run for profit, even though Postal Service has never been meant to be a money-making system. And really, we already have for-profit Postal Service. That's what FedEx and UPS and all of that is, basically. That's not what the United States Postal Service should be trying to emulate, and it's not what it was ever meant to do. I suppose at this point, the only way around this new ruling is to have everything that you want to mail that has a time-sensitive component mailed weeks in advance of the cutoff date, so that there's no way that it will not arrive in time. But there's absolutely going to be examples where that's not an option, and sometimes you just forget or just weren't able to get to it until right before the deadline. Even assuming that this change is not directly related to mail-in voting and trying to make it harder for non-Republicans to have their mail-in votes counted, which I'm not fully convinced it is not, this rule change really just doesn't feel right. It has made it so that a postmark doesn't mean what it used to, and you cannot count on it to denote when you sent something. Only when the sorting facility got it, which Could be a day after you send it, could be a few days after. And the fact that you can't know that really undermines the trust that people have in the United States Postal Service. And that's just a real shame. People should be able to trust that their mail-in votes are arriving in time, and that all of their mail is arriving in time and is marked as such, not just when the sorting facility gets around to it. That's the U.S. Postal Service people have come to trust and rely on since its inception, and that's not what we have anymore. When the time comes, I'm still going to mail in my vote, but I'm going to make sure it gets in well in advance, just in case. Alright guys, that'll be it for this episode of A Slice of News. I've been your host, Mr. Slice, and until next time, when I cut you off, another Slice of News. Oh, and before I forget, I'm on Spotify and Apple Podcasts now, so please rate and review the show. They really help exposure and bring people in to listen. So thanks for that.